These are the final resting places of 30 authors who defined the literary landscape of the 1980s, and whose deaths left silences in the culture that no subsequent writer has entirely filled. Their graves spread from a Pacific Washington cemetery to a Colorado flatlands town to a French hillside village, each one the last address of a life spent entirely in language. Philip K. Dick was buried after he died on March 2, 1982, at age 53. Disconnected from life support at a Santa Ana hospital following 2 strokes in 1 week, his ashes taken by his father to Riverside Cemetery in Fort Morgan, Colorado, and placed in a grave beside his twin sister Jane, who had died in infancy and whose headstone had carried both their names for the 53 years between her death and his. The science fiction writer who produced 45 novels and 121 short stories while living in near poverty died 4 months before Blade Runner, the film adaptation of Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep, opened to audiences who had no idea the man who imagined it was already gone. John Cheever was buried after he died from kidney cancer on June 18, 1982, at age 70. Laid to rest at First Parish Cemetery in Norwell, Massachusetts, the South Shore town south of Boston, where his family had deep roots and where the flags of Ossining, New York, the Hudson River suburb he had made famous in his fiction, were lowered to half-staff for 10 days after his death. Eddie, the author of the Wapshot Chronicle and the Pulitzer Prize-winning stories of John Cheever, had spent most of his adult life drinking with the disciplined commitment of a man who had confused the habit with the talent that ran alongside it, stopping only in his final decade and producing in those sober years the work that made his reputation permanent. John Gardner was cremated after he died on September 14, 1982, at age 49, from injuries sustained when his motorcycle left a road near Susquehanna, Pennsylvania, and his ashes were scattered in the Susquehanna River at his request. The novelist and critic who had written Grendel, The Sunlight Dialogues, Ache and October Light, and had published On Moral Fiction, the 1978 polemic that accused most of contemporary American literature of being trivial, dying 2 days before he was to be married for the 3rd time. He had been a productive and genuinely influential figure in American letters and died at the moment when his career was arguably beginning its most interesting phase, the motorcycle taking what was still being built. William Saroyan was buried after he died from prostate cancer on May 18, 1981, at age 72, in Fresno, California. The city where he had been born, the city his fiction had spent 50 years mythologizing, the city where he died approximately 1 mile from the house where he first opened his eyes. He had requested that his cremated ashes be divided in 2, half placed at Ararat Cemetery in Fresno, California, all in the Armenian immigrant burial ground, whose stones had appeared in his stories for decades, and half sent to the Commodus Pantheon in Yerevan, Armenia, the homeland whose loss had organized his entire literary imagination. He was the first and only individual honored with a joint commemorative postal stamp by both the United States and the Soviet Union. Tennessee Williams was buried after he died on February 25, 1983, at age 71, found dead in his room at the Hotel Elysee on East 54th Street in Manhattan, having choked on the plastic cap of a nasal spray bottle while intoxicated on a combination of drugs and alcohol, a death so incongruous with the scale of his life that the coroner's report required several readings to accept. The playwright who won 2 Pulitzer Prizes, for A Streetcar Named Desire in 1948 and Cat on a Hot Tin Roof in 1955, had requested burial at sea, but his brother refused, and he was interred at Calvary Cemetery in St. Louis, Missouri, the city of his complicated youth and the city he had spent his career fleeing on the page. Raymond Carver was buried after he died from lung cancer on August 2, 1988, at age 50. At his home in Port Angeles, Washington, having married his companion of 10 years, the poet Tess Gallagher, 6 weeks before his death, in a ceremony they both knew was also a goodbye, laid to rest at Ocean View Cemetery in Port Angeles, a small cemetery on the edge of the Strait of Juan de Fuca in the Pacific Northwest town, where he had spent his final productive years. His tombstone is engraved with his poem, Late Fragment, which ends with the line to call myself beloved, to feel myself beloved on the earth. And the small metal box at the base of the grave holds a notebook for visitors that Gallagher has replenished for more than 3 decades. James Baldwin was buried after he died from stomach cancer on December 1st, 1987, at age 63, at his home in Saint-Paul-de-Vence, France, the hilltop Provençal village where he had lived for the last decade of his life, writing and entertaining and conducting the affairs of a man who had become the moral conscience of American literature without ever having set out to carry that weight. His body returned to New York and interred at Ferncliff Cemetery in Hartsdale, Westchester County, alongside his mother, Bertis Baldwin, the author of Go Tell It on the Mountain, Giovanni's Room, and The Fire. Next Time had left the United States in 1948 and returned often but never again for long, France having offered him a distance from American racial violence that he found necessary for work and for breath. Truman Capote was buried after he died on August 25, 1984, at age 59, at the Bel Air home of his longtime friend Joanne Carson, from liver disease complicated by multiple drug intoxications, the author of Breakfast at Tiffany's and In Cold Blood. Having spent his final years largely estranged from the New York social world, he had once commanded after the publication of excerpts from his unfinished novel, Answered Prayers, revealed portraits his closest friends recognized immediately. He is interred at Westwood Village Memorial Park in Los Angeles, his ashes placed alongside those of his companion, Jack Dunphy, at the cemetery plot adjacent to Marilyn Monroe's, a proximity that the literary hub has noted he would have found considerably more satisfying than she would have. Lillian Hellman was buried after she died from a heart attack on June 30, 1984, at age 77, at her home in Vineyard Haven, Martha's Vineyard, Massachusetts. The playwright and memoirist who had written The Little Foxes and the Children's Hour, and had stood up before the House Un-American Activities Committee in 1952 to deliver the most famous refusal in the history of that committee, laid to rest at Abel's Hill Cemetery in Chilmark on Martha's Vineyard, the island where she had summered for decades and where her close friend John Belushi had been buried 2 years before. She is interred beside Dashiell Hammett, her companion of 30 years, their shared stone, one of the most visited graves on an island that has accumulated a remarkable concentration of American cultural history in its small churchyards. Irwin Shaw was buried after he died from heart failure on May 16, 1984, at age 71, in Davos, Switzerland, where he had been living for years. The American novelist and playwright who had written Rich Man, Poor Man and The Young Lions and had been one of the most commercially successful American writers of the post-war era, laid to rest at the Cimetière de Davos in the Swiss Alpine resort town that had become his home after he left the United States in 1951, partly to escape the political pressures of the McCarthy era. He had lived in Paris and then Klosters and finally Davos, and he died in the European exile that had shaped the final decades of his writing life. The grave in Switzerland, the last stop of a career that had begun in Brooklyn and never fully returned there. Bernard Malamud was cremated after he died from a cardiac arrest on March 18, 1986, at age 71, at his Manhattan apartment. The novelist who had won the Pulitzer Prize and the National Book Award for The Fixer in 1966, and had also written The Natural and the Assistant, leaving no permanent grave, his ashes scattered at a Vermont property he had loved, and where he had done much of his most considered work. He had taught at Bennington College in Vermont for the final decades of his career, returning each winter to the Columbia University neighborhood in New York, where he had been born and raised, and where he died in the same borough that had given him the specific density of immigrant Jewish American experience that ran through every paragraph he ever published. John D. MacDonald was cremated after he died from cardiac complications on December 28, 1986, at age 70, in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, following open-heart surgery, no permanent interment established. The author of the 21 Travis McGee novels, each titled with a color, each set in the Florida he had made his home. Having spent his final years in Sarasota, Florida, writing in a manner that suggested a man who had no intention of stopping. He had published 500 and something short stories, more than 60 novels, and had sold over 70 million books before the surgery in Milwaukee ended it. The prolific output of a lifetime, compressed into numbers that obscure how consistently good the work behind them was. Stephen King called him the greatest entertainer of his era and meant it as the highest available compliment. Chester Himes was buried after he died from Parkinson's disease and a series of strokes on November 12, 1984, at age 75, at his home in Moreira, Spain, the African-American novelist who had written the Harlem Detective series, featuring Coffin Ed Johnson and Gravedigger Jones, and had spent his last 30 years as an expatriate in Europe, first in Paris, then in Spain, and refusing to return to a United States that had imprisoned him for armed robbery, and had then received his literary work with the kind of institutional indifference that European publishers had not shared. He is buried at La Minglanilla Cemetery in Moreira, on the Costa Blanca of Spain, the Mediterranean light of his exile, the final condition of a life that had contained enough material for 5 separate literary careers. Jean Genet was buried after he died from throat cancer on April 15, 1986, at age 75, in a Paris hotel room. The French playwright and novelist who had written The Maids, The Balcony, The Thief's Journal, and Our Lady of the Flowers from a position of total social marginality, convicted thief, prostitute, war and homosexual in the France of the mid-20th century, and had been pardoned from a life sentence by Jean Cocteau and Jean-Paul Sartre before becoming one of the most significant literary figures in the French language. He is buried at the Spanish cemetery in Larache, Morocco, a colonnaded Christian cemetery in the Moroccan port city, where he had spent considerable time in his final years, his grave in a Muslim country on the African continent, the last deliberate contradiction of a life built entirely from them. Simone de Beauvoir was buried after she died from pneumonia on April 14, 1986, at age 78, at the Cochin Hospital in Paris. It's the philosopher and author of The Second Sex and the Mandarins, the woman whose 1949 feminist treatise restructured the conversation about gender in the 20th century, and whose companion Jean-Paul Sartre she had outlived by 6 years, laid to rest at Cimetière du Montparnasse in Paris, in the same grave as Sartre, the two of them together in the Montparnasse Cemetery, whose stones include Samuel Beckett, Guy de Maupassant, and Marguerite Duras. Her grave is among the most visited in the cemetery, consistently covered in lipstick kisses and metro tickets left by visitors who consider her the more essential half of the most famous literary partnership of the 20th century. Jorge Luis Borges was buried after he died from hepatocellular carcinoma on June 14, 1986, at age 86, at his home in Geneva, Switzerland. The Argentine writer who had invented postmodern fiction before the term existed, and whose short story collections, Ficciones and Labyrinths, had influenced every serious novelist working in the second half of the 20th century, laid to rest at the Cimetière des Rois, the Cemetery of Kings, in Plain Palais, Geneva, near the grave of John Calvin. His headstone is inscribed in Old English with lines from the Battle of Malden that translate as, "Do not fear at all," a phrase that his wife Maria Kodama chose for the man who had spent his writing life exploring the labyrinths of time, identity, and the nature of the self. He died in Geneva, having left Buenos Aires 2 months before his death. Primo Levi was found dead on April 11, 1987, at age 67, at the bottom of the stairwell of his apartment building in Turin, Italy. In a fall that the investigating magistrate ruled a suicide, and that his friends and readers have debated ever since, the chemist and writer who had survived Auschwitz and documented the experience in If This Is a Man with a precision that made the book among the most essential Holocaust testimonies in any language laid to rest, at the Jewish cemetery in Turin, the city where he had been born and where he had worked at a paint factory for 30 years, while writing the books that made him famous in the final decades of his life. He had told an interviewer that a survivor who writes has an obligation to go on writing, and his death silenced the voice that had carried that obligation most faithfully. Mary McCarthy was buried after she died from lung cancer on October 25, 1989, at age 77, at New York Hospital in Manhattan. The novelist and critic who had written The Group, Memories of a Catholic Girlhood, and Vietnam, and had been involved in the most celebrated literary feud of the 20th century, her 1979 statement that every word Lillian Hellman writes is a lie, including and the, had produced a lawsuit that outlasted them both, laid to rest at the Annandale Cemetery in Annandale-on-Hudson, New York, near Bard College, where her husband James West had academic ties. She had been described by the New York Review of Books as the best mind in American letters, a compliment she received with the particular skepticism she brought to all received opinions. Rebecca West was buried after she died from natural causes on March 15, 1983, at age 90, in a London nursing home. The British journalist, novelist, and critic-born Cicely Isabel Fairfield, who had covered the Nuremberg trials, had an illegitimate son with H.G. Wells, and had written Black Lamb and Grey Falcon, the 1,100-page masterwork on Yugoslavia and Balkan history, with the thoroughness and authority of a historian who happened also to be one of the finest prose stylists of her century. Laid to rest at Brookwood Cemetery in Woking, Surrey, England. She had been made a Dame Commander of the Order of the British Empire in 1959 and had spent the following 24 years continuing to write with the same fierce intelligence that had characterized every decade of her career. Jean-Paul Sartre was buried after he died from pulmonary edema on April 15, 1980, at age 74, at the Broussais Hospital in Paris. The philosopher and author of Being and Nothingness, No Exit, Ins and Nausea, whose public funeral drew 50,000 mourners into the streets of Paris behind his coffin on April 19th. A spontaneous outpouring in the 14th arrondissement that constituted one of the largest public mourning events in modern French history. He is interred at Cimetière du Montparnasse in Paris, and when Simone de Beauvoir died 6 years later, she was placed in the same grave. The partnership in philosophy and literature that had defined the French intellectual left for 50 years finally consolidated beneath a single stone in the cemetery he had once written about, as a place where time stops and meaning begins. Joseph Campbell was cremated after he died from esophageal cancer on October 30th, 1987, at age 83, at his home in Honolulu, Hawaii. The mythologist and author of The Hero with a Thousand Faces, whose 6-part conversation with journalist Bill Moyers was broadcast on PBS in 1988 and introduced the concept of the hero's journey to the widest popular audience it had ever reached, no permanent interment established. He had been a professor at Sarah Lawrence College for 38 years, had written across Hindu, Greek, Norse, Native American, and Arthurian mythology simultaneously, and had influenced George Lucas's construction of Star Wars more directly than Lucas has always been credited with acknowledging. The broadcast of The Power of Myth came after his death, the conversation reaching its largest audience after the man was gone. Italo Calvino was buried after he died from a cerebral hemorrhage on September 19, 1985, at age 61, at a hospital in Siena, Italy. They, the Italian novelist and journalist who had written Invisible Cities, If on a Winter's Night, A Traveler, and Cosmic Comics, and had been considered a near-certain recipient of the Nobel Prize in Literature in 1985, a prize that went unreceived because the Nobel Committee does not make posthumous awards, and the stroke came 2 months before the announcement. Laid to rest at the cemetery of Castiglione della Pescaia in the Maremma region of Tuscany, the coastal countryside, where he had been spending the summer at the time of his collapse. The Nobel Committee confirmed after his death that he had been on the shortlist. Raymond Williams was buried after he died from a stroke on January 26, 1988, at age 66. At his home in Saffron Walden, Essex, England, the Welsh cultural critic and novelist who had written Culture and Society, Ike the Long Revolution, and The Country and the City, and who had been one of the most influential voices in British cultural studies and socialist thought for 4 decades, laid to rest at Saffron Walden Cemetery in the Essex market town where he had spent his final years. He had grown up in the Welsh border village of Pandy, the son of a railway signalman, and had built at Cambridge University an academic career that his critics found insufficiently radical and his allies found indispensable. His grave in Essex is close to the English countryside he had analyzed so penetratingly as a site of contested cultural meaning. John Updike was buried after he died from lung cancer on January 27, 2009, at age 76, at a hospice facility in Danvers, Massachusetts, laid to rest at Mount Auburn Cemetery in Cambridge, Massachusetts, in the nationally significant landscape cemetery along the Charles River that is among the most visited historical sites in New England. The author of the Rabbit Angstrom tetralogy, 4 novels following the same working-class Pennsylvania man from young adulthood to death, won 2 Pulitzer Prizes for fiction for Rabbit is Rich in 1981 and Rabbit at Rest in 1990. and published more than 60 books across a career of such consistent output that his detractors considered the volume evidence against the quality, while his admirers considered the quality evidence against the detractors. He is among the most visited graves in his section of Mount Auburn. Nelson Algren was buried after he died from a heart attack on May 9, 1981, at age 72, in his cottage in Sag Harbor, New York. But the Chicago novelist who had written The Man with the Golden Arm and A Walk on the Wild Side, and had been called by Ernest Hemingway one of the two best American writers of his generation, laid to rest at Sag Harbor Cemetery in Sag Harbor, Suffolk County, New York, on the east end of Long Island, where he had moved in the final years of his life in an attempt to revive a literary career that Chicago had exhausted. He had been planning to attend his induction into the American Academy of Arts and Letters the following week when the heart attack came. He died alone in the cottage, found by a friend who had come to help him prepare for the ceremony. Robert Graves was buried after he died from heart failure on December 7, 1985, at age 90, at the San Juan de Dios Cemetery in Daya, on the northwest coast of Mallorca, Spain, amid the village where he had lived for most of his adult life since arriving there with poet Laura Riding in 1929 and establishing the literary community that drew writers to the Mallorcan hills for the following 6 decades. The poet and novelist who had written Goodbye to All That, the autobiography of his service on the Western Front during the First World War, and the historical novels Eric Claudius and Claudius the God had spent 66 years in the same village, a depth of rootedness unusual for any writer and extraordinary for one who had seen as much of the world as Graves had seen before, deciding the hills above the Mediterranean were the only place worth being. These 30 writers shaped what literature was capable of in the decade when reading was still the primary technology for encountering a mind other than your own. Their graves and scatterings in unmarked desert locations, the final evidence of lives that produced in most cases more than any reader has time to receive, the books outlasting the hands that wrote them by decades and still counting.